All right, so are you ready for this? We're about to dive into something that might just completely change the way you see the world. Like, seriously, we're talking about determinism. Basically, the idea that free will, yeah, that might actually be a total illusion.
Wow. Yes.
Right? So, we're going to be looking at some excerpts from this book that goes deep into like neuroscience and philosophy and all this stuff about human behavior. It gets pretty wild.
Yeah. I mean, it really makes you think about like what really drives our choices and actions.
Totally.
And the thing is, this deep dive, what's really fascinating is that we're not just exploring determinism, we're actually going to focus on how accepting this lack of free will, as crazy as it sounds, might actually be like a path to liberation.
Okay, now you've got me really intrigued. But before we go full on Matrix here, let's start with the story. The book mentions these two mothers, right, living on totally different continents, and they both gave their kids the exact same super weird piece of hygiene advice. They said, and I'm quoting here, "If you wipe back to front, you won't have any friends." I know, right?
It's so strange. Like, out of all the things to say,
Exactly.
it's like, what are the chances?
Right.
And it really makes you wonder about all those seemingly random things that shape our lives and the choices we make. And the book, it keeps playing with this idea. It talks about people who have like crazy luck, like surviving both the Bay Bridge collapse and 9/11.
Oh, wow.
I know.
Talk about defying the odds.
Seriously.
But then it also goes into like the opposite side of that. Like there's this story about a guy who was almost a beetle. Almost.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's got to be both amazing and crushing.
Right. It makes you think about like what determines these outcomes. Is it fate? Is it just random chance? Or is it, something else entirely?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's what this whole idea of determinism really gets at. It's like, if everything is predetermined, then what does that mean for, the choices we make and the paths our lives take?
Right.
And this whole exploration of meaning, in a universe that might just be a series of cause and effect events, it leads to this concept called terror management theory.
Terror management theory. Okay, I gotta admit, that sounds a little intense. Can you break that down for me?
Sure. So basically, it's this theory about how we, as humans, deal with the fact that death is inevitable and that, life might not actually have any inherent meaning.
Okay, yeah, I can see where the terror part comes in.
Right. It's kind of heavy stuff.
Okay.
But the theory is that we create all these structures and beliefs and stories to help us manage that, like existential dread.
So like religion and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. But also things like, the pursuit of success or finding love or leaving a legacy, all these things that give our lives meaning and purpose.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. So
Yeah.
you're saying that even the idea of free will itself could be part of that? Like a way to feel like we have some control in a world that can feel really chaotic and unpredictable?
Exactly. It's like a way to make sense of the chaos and feel like we're not just, leaves blowing in the wind.
Right.
And what's interesting is that the book points out how many philosophers, even those who logically believe in a deterministic world, where everything's predetermined, they still try to find some room for free will in their thinking. It's almost like this deep-seated need we have to believe that we have agency in our lives.
Like we can't let go of it even if it doesn't logically make sense.
Right.
It's like we're clinging to this idea for dear life.
And what's really interesting? The book mentions this study where depressed individuals were actually more accurate in assessing their control over events.
Wait, really?
Yeah, compared to people who weren't depressed.
So it's like depression somehow makes you more realistic about your lack of free will.
It's almost like that, like it removes the rose-colored glasses and lets people see things as they really are.
Wow. That's kind of a mind-blowing thought. But it makes sense in a way. If you're depressed, you're probably not feeling very in control of your life anyway.
Yeah, I guess that's true. But it really makes you question, like, how much of what we perceive as free will is actually just this comforting illusion, something our minds create to help us navigate the world and not completely freak out.
Right. But then if we don't really have free will, that raises a whole bunch of other questions, doesn't it? Like some pretty big ones.
Definitely.
Like if our choices are already predetermined, then doesn't that mean we can't hold people accountable for their actions?
Yeah, that's a big one.
Right. And like, wouldn't everyone just, I don't know, run amok if they believe they had no control?
It's a natural concern, and it's something the author definitely addresses head on in the book.
Okay, good. Because
right.
I'm already feeling a little unsettled by all of this.
I get it. It's definitely a lot to wrap your head around. But the thing is, the evidence doesn't really point in that direction.
What do you mean?
Like, studies have actually shown that when people understand the biological basis of behavior, it doesn't make them more likely to do bad stuff.
So it's not like a free pass to just go wild.
Nope, not at all.
Huh.
It's not about saying, oh, it's not my fault, my brain made me do it. It's more about understanding that our actions are influenced by a whole bunch of factors, some of which we have control over and some of which we don't.
Okay, so where does the liberating part come in?
Well, the book argues that recognizing this lack of free will, while kind of scary at first, can actually be really freeing, especially for people who've been struggling with things they feel like they can't control.
I'm not sure I follow. How can not having free will be liberating?
Okay, picture this. Imagine someone with a leptin mutation.
Leptin.
It's a hormone that tells your brain when you're full.
Ah, okay.
So for someone with this mutation, they never really feel satisfied,
Oh, wow.
which a lot of times leads to obesity.
I can only imagine how frustrating that would be.
Right. It's like you're constantly battling your own body.
And probably feeling like you're failing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even if you're trying your hardest.
Yeah.
And for years, this person might blame themselves, thinking, oh, it's just a lack of willpower.
Right, right.
But then they discover, wait, my struggle isn't because I'm weak or lazy. It's because of this biological thing I have absolutely no control over.
That must be a huge realization.
It is. It can be a real turning point.
Like a weight lifted off your shoulders.
Exactly. It's
So-
not about personal failure anymore. It's about understanding the hand you were dealt.
And working with it.
Exactly.
So it's like taking ownership, but in a different way.
Yeah, I guess you could say that.
Yeah.
And the book goes on to highlight just how much self-loathing people experience for things like ADHD, autism, even being short or unattractive.
Yeah. It's crazy how much we judge ourselves and others for things that are often like completely out of our control.
Totally. And these are just a few examples. The book is full of stories about people who finally found peace and self-acceptance after learning that their struggles were rooted in things they couldn't change.
That's amazing.
It is. And it's really eye-opening when you start to think about how much of what we consider personal flaws are actually just biological differences.
Or even just like random chance.
Yeah, exactly.
Like you can't choose your genes. You can't choose the environment you were raised in.
Nope. And yet, we still have this tendency to blame ourselves and others for things that are often beyond our control.
Which is kind of crazy when you think about it.
It is. And it's a big part of what the author is trying to challenge with his book.
So if we're not supposed to blame people for their choices, then what are we supposed to do?
Well, the author argues that understanding determinism doesn't mean abandoning the concept of justice altogether.
Okay, good. Because I was starting to worry about that.
It's a common concern.
Yeah.
But he's not saying we should just let everyone off the hook.
So then what is he saying?
It's more about shifting our focus. Instead of punishment, he advocates for a more rehabilitative approach, one that recognizes the complex web of factors that contribute to a person's actions.
Okay, I can see that.
It's about understanding the root causes of behavior and then creating environments that foster positive choices.
So, like, instead of just throwing people in jail, we should be trying to help them address the underlying issues that might have led them to commit a crime in the first place.
Exactly.
Okay, I mean, that makes sense. But it's a pretty different way of thinking about justice than what we're used to.
It is. But the author argues that it's a much more humane and effective approach.
It's a lot to think about.
It is. But I think it's an important conversation to have,
Yeah, definitely.
especially if we want to create a more just and compassionate world. And it's not just about, like, societal change, you know. The book also talks about how accepting this lack of free will can be personally liberating.
Yeah, you mentioned that before.
Right. Like, once you kind of let go of that illusion of control, you can start to release all that self-blame and judgment we tend to carry around.
I can see that.
It's about, like, being kinder to ourselves.
And to others.
Exactly. And, you know, it's like that example we talked about before.
The person with the leptin mutation.
Yeah, exactly. Like, once they understood that their struggle with weight wasn't some moral failing, but, you know, a biological reality, it was like this huge weight was lifted.
Right. It's not about blaming yourself anymore. It's about understanding.
Exactly. And, you know, the author goes even further. Talks about how we should, like, embrace the absurdity of hating anyone for anything they've done.
Whoa, okay. That's a pretty radical thought.
It is, isn't it?
Oh.
But his point is that their actions, even the ones that cause harm, are ultimately the result of this, like, long chain of events, things that are mostly beyond their control.
Yeah, I mean, I get the logic. But it's still hard to wrap your head around
It is. It goes against a lot of what we've been taught to believe.
about personal responsibility and all that.
Right.
But I guess if we could really internalize this idea of determinism, it could like radically change how we interact with the world,
Absolutely. It would change everything.
how we see ourselves, how we treat each other.
It's about, like, shifting from judgment to curiosity,
Mm-hmm.
from blame to understanding.
Yeah.
The author talks about this vision of the future where, we approach each other with more empathy, where we recognize that everyone's carrying around their own unique set of circumstances.
It's a pretty beautiful vision.
It is. It's a world where compassion and understanding replace, blame and punishment.
It's definitely not an easy shift to make,
No.
but if we can do it, the rewards could be huge.
Totally. And, he ends the book with this really interesting thought.
What's that?
He suggests that future generations, with their advanced understanding of the brain and behavior, they'll probably look back at us and wonder why we clung to this idea of free will for so long. They'll probably be like, wait, you guys really believe that?
It'll be like, how we look back at people who thought the earth was flat.
Exactly.
But hopefully they'll also see that, we were trying, that we were moving towards a more humane way of being, even if we didn't always get it right.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Well, this has been quite a deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground: free will, determinism, compassion.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride.
It really has. But I think the biggest takeaway for me is just how much potential there is for a more compassionate world, if we can just let go of some of our old ways of thinking.
I agree. It's about, challenging those deeply ingrained beliefs that we often take for granted.
And opening ourselves up to new possibilities.
Exactly.
So if you're listening to this and feeling a little mind blown, that's totally normal.
It's a lot to process.
But keep thinking about these ideas. Keep exploring. Because even if free will is an illusion, the power of compassion is very real.
And it might just be the key to creating a better future for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, that's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And until next time, keep those minds open. And remember, even in a world without free will, we can still choose